Hello, everyone. Welcome to Balancing Standardization Against the Need for Creativity. I'm Gretel Kinsey from Scriptorium, and I would like to introduce my colleague, Alan Pringle, who's going to be giving this presentation. So, hello, Alan.
Hey there, Gretel.
I'm going to turn
So,
it over to you now.
thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, maybe even good morning for some folks. I am Alan Pringle, and I want to talk with you today about balancing standardization against the need for creativity in structured authoring. First, I want to take care of a little housekeeping about this webcast. If you would locate the questions module and go to webinar, and during the webcast, if you have questions or comments, please type them in there because that's where we look for them during the event. Also, all attendees are muted during this webcast. We are recording this event, but your name will not be shown in the recording, and we will send you a link to the recording after we process and post it. I also want to tell you a little bit about me. I am the Chief Operating Officer at Scriptorium. I've worked here since the company started in 1997. And Scriptorium, we're based in Durham, North Carolina in the US. We are a content strategy consultancy. We help companies fix their content problems. I am the author, or I should say co-author, of a few books, including Content Strategy 101 and Technical Writing 101. I have been working with structured content since my days in college, where I worked on the weekly student newspaper. We use a very basic markup language to create the columns of text that were then pasted into sheets, which were then photographed, negatives made, and then transferred to plates. For those of you who remember long ago the way that we used to print broadsheet newspapers, well, that's what I did, and I use XML to create the columns of content for that. When I'm not working on content and content strategy projects, I enjoy spending a lot of time in the mountains of western North Carolina. And I took this photo just about a year ago when I was up there on the Blue Ridge Parkway. I also have a very deep appreciation of good pastry, including the donut that just popped up on your screen there. That is a creme brulee donut from a donut shop that is, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, right down the street from our office here at Scriptorium. I don't know how well you can see inside that donut, but it has got a custard in it with little flecks of vanilla bean in it, and the top has been torched, so you've got caramelized sugar on it, just like a good creme brulee is supposed to. That is a really good donut, by the way. I probably shouldn't be looking at that right now, but enough about pastry. You're not here for that. Let's talk a little bit about structured authoring. There is a common stereotype that structured authoring is rigid, it's unbending, and it's free of any creativity. In my experience, the opposite is true. Creativity is absolutely required for implementing structured workflows, and the business requirements often demand flexibility and creativity in how content is developed and in how it's distributed. I want to share 3 short case studies with you, and these are based on Scriptorium's collaborations with clients in the past. These case studies are going to show you how companies have addressed this balance between creativity and standardization. And these 3 case studies are communicating layout specifications for automated outputs, flexibility in layout as a business requirement, and considering the true costs of customized structures. So let's move on to the first case study, and it is about collecting the layout specifications for output, such as a PDF file. In unstructured desktop publishing environments, template designers have a visual interface for developing the layout of print and PDF output. As shown here in this slide, this screenshot, the interface of a desktop publishing program enables the template designers to specify what each style is going to look like. You specify the font size, the spacing above and below the paragraph, those sort of settings. Desktop publishing tools also give the template designer and the content creators as well immediate confirmation of what formatting looks like when it is applied to the content. As you can see by that heading 1 paragraph up top, it's got the heading 1 formatting applied to it, and you get immediate visual confirmation of what that heading looks like. That visual aspect of formatting, both from the creation of the formatting and the application, those are both missing in structured workflows that generate automated PDF output. Instead, you have code that specifies the formatting. This code here shows formatting for a heading 1 paragraph in PDF output. And as you can see from those settings in there, the code specifies the font, font size, line height, excuse me, color, and other facets of what a paragraph would look like in PDF output. And this information is the same kind of stuff that you see in the interface for designing a style in a desktop publishing tool. This code in style sheets, it is what automatically converts the source XML content into PDF output. And let me give you a very quick overview of how this kind of code in these style sheets fit into a typical workflow for creating automated PDF output. First, you have your source XML files, and then you collect them together to create whatever deliverable it is that you want to create. For example, let's say a user guide for a product or service. So you collect the XML that you want for that guide, and then you apply style sheets to them. And this is where that coding that I just showed you, that's where this coding lives. And then in a few minutes or seconds, you get a PDF file as the result. Style sheet programmers use a text or XML editor to develop the code for the style sheets that defines the formatting. They don't have a visual interface for defining the styles, and you don't generally see an instant preview of what that style looks like, as you do with your desktop publishing tools. Coding in these style sheets specify all the aspects of the PDF layout, the page size, font use, and spacing, anything else that you would have to specify for a PDF or print page. So how do you get this kind of formatting information from the interface-based desktop publishing environment, like you see in here? This is FrameMaker, by the way, to the more code-based style sheet environment that we just talked about. This is a challenge, and what we ended up doing at Scriptorium is, in our early efforts to gather the formatting information, our style sheet programmers would pull the specifications from the paragraph styles, the table styles, and so on from the existing desktop publishing templates. And if you've ever had to basically reverse engineer a template yourself, you probably know that's not very efficient, because we did not know the full history of the templates. For example, there may have been a style in there that the company was no longer using and we didn't know about it, but we would end up creating basically the same thing for the new style sheet environment, And that effort was really for nothing because they didn't really need that particular kind of formatting. Also, there were usually template changes and formatting changes the template designer wanted to make to match new corporate branding requirements, for example, or you wanted to freshen up the formatting and look, the fonts. Those are the kinds of things that would often need to be changed. And it's pretty common if a company knew that they were going to be moving to a new publishing process, they would hold off on making any changes to their templates because they didn't want to make the changes in the old environment and then turn around and duplicate those changes in the new environment. So they would basically hold a lot of these kind of changes and want to implement them as part of the new process. So when we would find out, yes, there are some changes, we would ask, well, what are these changes? And the kinds of requests we would get would be like, make the chapter heading a little bit bigger, or something like, please change the heading color to our new corporate blue. These requests were absolutely reasonable, but style sheets require very specific numbers. How many points is a little bigger? And if I had a long time working relationship with this template designer, I may have a better idea what a little bigger would be in that person's mind. But because I did not have that long time relationship with them, we would just have to ask, how many points do you mean when you say bigger? Also, we would not usually have the knowledge of, for example, what is the Pantone color code for your new corporate blue? We would have to ask to get that information. So to improve this communication between template designers and style sheet programmers, one of our programmers here at Scriptorium developed a process that relies on, guess what? Style sheets. First, the programmer added very detailed code comments to the style sheets. And here's an example of a comment for the page size settings. You can see from this comment, it specifies the page size for US letter, the page size for A4 paper, and also a size that is kind of a compromise. It can be printed on both A4 and letter size paper. So we would add a comment like this into the style sheet code. The style sheet programmer then developed another style sheet based process that would extract those code comments like you see here and create a Microsoft Word file that compiled them all. And you may be thinking, why are you doing Microsoft Word? Aren't you trying to move more to a more automated away from desktop publishing process? Yes, that is true. But because Word is on so many people's machines, and because even if they don't have Word installed, they could go download one of the free open source equivalents, such as LibreOffice, to open the file. So we view Word as kind of a universal format that most people could open, which is why we chose it. The Word file explains each setting in the style sheets, and here is an example showing that code comment in regard to the page size. You can see that here highlighted in the blue. There is that comment up top, and then underneath you have the page size settings, the default current values, which by the way are the page size settings that the compromise between A4 and US letter, and a few other settings below as well for margins, margin values, and that sort of thing. And at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a link to this Word file so you can download it. Even if you don't choose to work with us here at Scriptorium and you are planning to do some style sheet development, feel free to download this and kind of use it as a way to collect information you may need to develop your own PDF style sheets. So The template designer would take this Word file, review the settings in it, modify and add values as necessary in the file, and then return the Word file to a style sheet programmer at Scriptorium. And with that file in hand, the programmer had the very specific information and measurements he or she needed to develop and complete the style sheets. The very detailed code comments in those style sheets also provide a kind of a bonus. They will serve as a reference later to anyone at the client company who maintains those style sheets. With those very detailed notes in that style sheet code, you don't have to have programmer level knowledge to change the more basic formatting parameters. So if you wanted to change, for example, the font size of a heading 1 paragraph, you could just find the code comments that mention that heading, find that setting, and change it there, and not have to rely on a programmer to do it for you. This new process has really made developing these PDF style sheets much more efficient for us at Scriptorium, and that really helps out our clients because they get to see their automated output a lot more quickly because it takes us less time to develop the style sheets. So this process has worked out really well for us. I want to move on now to the second case study, and this case study focuses on how flexibility and layout can be a business requirement. Automated PDF formatting, like we just discussed for that PDF output case study, works really well for certain types of information. Technical content in particular is generally a very good candidate for automated PDF formatting. However, it is not a good match for all kinds of information types. A lot of marketing content is not a good match. And in the case of one of our clients, they were printing and selling highly designed study guides that required a lot of flexibility in layout. Production specialists used InDesign to develop these guides, and they spent a lot of time refining the layouts. They adjusted the position of images, how text broke across pages, how line breaks, and so on. They worked really hard to ensure that the visual flow of content really helped the readers comprehend the information in those study guides. These guides were printed and sold, so they were a commercial product. Therefore, it was very important that this company maintain that very high quality layout that they had with these InDesign based books while the company transitioned to structured authoring. So how could they preserve those high quality layouts that their customers expected while moving to structured content? Some programmers at Scriptorium developed some style sheets that transformed the source XML content into an XML file that is compatible with InDesign. This InDesign compatible XML references styles that are in the InDesign template. And I'm going to show you an example of that XML. And this XML is based on the InDesign markup language IDML. And I'll give you some resources on this later on. So, in this little chunk of InDesign markup language, we can see that the paragraph style of body is being applied to this content, which is actually just one sentence, excuse me. So it's, to get technical, a fairly verbose markup language. There's a lot of lines of text there for just one sentence. Within this sentence, we are also applying a character style called bold. So a production specialist would take this IDML file, they would place it inside the InDesign template. And when the production specialist did that, the styles and other formatting were automatically applied to the content. And here you can see the sentence that was in the XML code I just showed you. The paragraph tag body has been applied to the text, and the word all is bold as the code specified. So this is a very simple example here. I know just one sentence, but in general, getting your source XML content to come across correctly in the IDML, the InDesign compatible XML, it can be a pretty tricky process. And you really have to kind of do this iterative process and keep testing, making changes, testing and making more changes, because it can take you a little bit of time to discover, for example, that your reference images are not coming across exactly as you intended. And one of my coworkers who has done several of these style sheets once said about it that this InDesign XML work, it's like Jenga, but it takes 5 minutes before you see whether or not the tower fell over. So once we had a fairly solid tower, to continue the analogy, we would then pass over those style sheets to the client so they could then create the InDesign compatible XML, place it into their template file, and flow the content into InDesign so the formatting was automatically applied. With this process in place, they could then adjust line breaks, pagination, image placement, and so on. So it was very much like their previous process where they had very fine control over the formatting in those files. So even though the content was flowed into InDesign, which is a desktop publishing tool, to create the final output, the XML source files for this content still had all of the benefits of structured content that the client really needed. And in this case, the client really wanted modular content, and they were very interested in reusing content. So on the source side, they had the benefit of that reuse, but on the output side, the InDesign, they still had the ability to finesse the formatting that they had in their previous workflow. With this new workflow in place, this publisher significantly reduced the time it took to produce their manuals because the formatting was automatically applied when the InDesign XML was placed into the InDesign template. So the publisher kept their very highly designed layouts, they got the benefit of XML, and they cut the amount of work it took to produce their printed guides. So it was a really good result all around. The client was happy, we were happy, so it worked out really well. Unfortunately, I cannot say things worked out really well in the next case study, which I'm going to tell you about right now. And I do see some questions, and I will get to them at the end of the session. The final case study that I want to talk about is considering the true cost of customized structures. When you're looking at balancing standardization that you get from structured content against creative requirements, it's not just about formatting. When a company is implementing structured authoring, they can develop a custom structure, or they can adopt an XML standard such as DITA, DocBook, those sort of things. So you can either kind of create your own or kind of jumpstart things by using an existing standard. If a company does choose a standard, they also have to evaluate whether to use the default structure as it is or to modify that standard structure to better match the company's requirements. And this discussion about whether to keep the structure as it is or to modify it is really creativity itself, the back and forth required to figure this out. So when should a company change default structures in a standard? This question came up for a client who implemented XML for fairly traditional reasons for moving to a structured workflow. They needed better control of their conditional content. They needed to support responsive design of HTML output for viewing information on smartphones and tablets. And they needed to manage their ever-increasing localization requirements. Every time they turned around, there was another market that they had to translate for. So they needed to be able to turn around localized content much more quickly. This company had large installation guides, and they were developed in desktop publishing software at the time. These guides, which could be hundreds of pages long, had many procedures in them, and some of those procedures were more than 100 steps long each. And these guides were distributed in print and PDF formats. And I see a question. In regard to standards, we are talking about industry standards here, such as DITA and DocBook. Those are industry standards for XML. There's also S1000D, that sort of thing. So the procedures in these guides, in addition to being 100 or more of them in one procedure, could contain both sub-steps and then another layer that I'm going to call sub-sub-steps. And let me show you an example so you can understand the layers of steps that I'm talking about here. So you had a step such as step number 63, and yes, there were step number 63, and sometimes there was step 110. There were lots of steps in these procedures. Then you could have a sub-step, and then you could have another layer of steps, which is the sub-sub-step. The content model that this client chose did not support that layer of sub-steps. So the content creators asked Scriptorium to add an element to handle those sub-steps. And now that you have seen the layers of steps and understand the challenge that we were facing at Scriptorium in regard to this sub-sub-step, I'm going to let you be an information architect and give me your advice on how to handle this situation. So I'm going to do a quick little quiz here, and there's just one question, and you can choose multiple answers. First, I'm going to show you the question and the answers, and then I'm going to start a poll in GoToWebinar so you can make a selection from your screen. The question is, my reaction to a 100-step procedure with 3 layers of steps is A, time to reevaluate, B, excellent tech comm, C, absolutely not, or D, a string of profanity that I will not say out loud because I'm going to keep this at least somewhat professional today, although in the privacy of our office here at Scriptorium, a few things were said, but like I said, I won't repeat what we said. So let me start that poll so you can respond, and I'll take a look at what you have to say. Okay, I'm going to give you a few more seconds. %71 have voted. Okay, I'm going to close it out so we can take a look at the results. So it looks like 65% said it was time to reevaluate, And 6% said excellent tech comm. We're just going to have to agree to disagree because I don't think it was. 23% said absolutely not, and 29% said a string of cuss words, and I have to agree with you very much. So thank you very much for that. So, as you can probably tell from those answers, Scriptorium thought that preserving those long procedures with those sub-steps was not a good idea. And we asked the content creators to consider, and we even said, please reconsider, and we were very nice about it. We proposed evaluating the level of effort it would take to modify that default structure to include the sub-steps against the effort it would take to maintain the default structure as it was set up by the standard and to rewrite the client's content to match the standard. So if we were going to modify the default structure to incorporate those sub-steps, it would require the following effort. First, we would have to develop and test the modification to the structure. We would then have to implement that change in multiple environments. We would have to do it in the authoring tool, in the client's component content management system, in the style sheets that created their outputs. And there was more than one output that they were planning to distribute. They wanted to do both HTML and they wanted to distribute PDF. In addition to all of those areas, these changes would also have to be distributed to the client's localization vendors so those vendors could turn around and implement these changes into their tool chains as well. Also, they would have to train the writers on this custom structure. If the company hired new content creators that were already familiar with the default structure, those writers would have to learn how to use the customized structure properly. So changing the default structure has an impact that goes well beyond the actual structural change itself. You have to consider all of those facets when evaluating the worth of a change to the structure. On the flip side of this, what would it take, effort-wise, to maintain that default structure and therefore not allow the sub-steps? First, the content creators would have to rethink the procedures to eliminate the sub-steps. Then they would have to rewrite those lengthy procedures as smaller related procedures. After all of this analysis, the content creators were still resistant to rewriting the content, and I'm sure you're completely unsurprised by that. They felt that the rewriting effort would have been way too much, and they're absolutely right. It would not have been an insignificant effort to rewrite this content. These writers believed that adding the sub-steps was the path of least resistance and greatest efficiency during this transition to structured content. They could essentially maintain the procedures exactly as they were in the desktop publishing environment with the addition of the new step level. There's another more subtle issue here at play, and it goes well beyond the structural change, and that is, I think that the writers had a bias against the new approach, because I believe that they thought if they agreed to rewrite this content, it would be an admission that the procedures as they were written were poorly structured. So basically, they would admit they had not been doing things correctly all along. The information architects on this project, and I was one of them, we believed that the short-term effort of rewriting the content would have great long-term benefits, there would be none of the costs that I talked about earlier in regard to the company's tool chain, the localization vendor's tool chain, and there would be no training required for the new writers who already had expertise with the XML standard as it was. I also rewrote some of these long procedures myself in the default structure. I broke up some of these long procedures into smaller related procedures, and in doing so, I even demonstrated increased reuse. And there is another consideration here that I think is also very important, and that is, what about the users accessing this content on tablets and smartphones? This client was wanting to move their content to HTML that would format well on phones and on tablets. Even if they had the HTML set up so it displayed and formatted well on tablets, can you imagine what it would take to read through 100+ steps with 3 layers of steps within a procedure on a phone or a tablet? I would not do that to my end user. I thought that is entirely too much to take in a PDF, much less in HTML on your phone. So, after all of this analysis, all this conversation, take a guess what happened. We could not come to an agreement on what to do with these procedures. There was no agreement on approach, and because we were working on a pilot project to demonstrate that things could work on a grander scale on this project, we were getting toward the end of the funding for this pilot project. We wanted to stay within the budget for this pilot, so we all agreed, the information architects and the content creators, we all agreed we would not go forward and implement this change for the pilot. The company then decided to hire its own information architect, who actually ended up being a former colleague of mine, and they would reevaluate that structural change later on. And if there's one moral to the story I would have to tell you, I think it is, not every consulting engagement has a happy ending. And if you're thinking about hiring a consultant and they tell you that every single job they've ever worked on was a success, you need to be very skeptical. One of two things is going on here. That first, that person has been in business for about 4 seconds, so they haven't had time for anything to go sideways yet, or B, they're just flat out telling you a lie. So when someone says, yes, everything I've touched has always been great, they're probably not telling the truth. So what did these 3 case studies show? If you're going to use technology to implement intelligent content, why not go a step further and use technology to improve communication among all of the project stakeholders? I don't care what kind of project you're working on, content or otherwise, strong communication is an absolute necessity in times of process change. Also, if business requirements demand flexibility in the formatting of structured content, you can implement processes to accommodate that requirement. The InDesign workflow we talked about earlier, it proves you can get the benefits of structured authoring and still have flexibility in formatting. Also, when you are considering structural changes, you need to look beyond just the structure itself and evaluate the costs of making that change, and look very hard at biases that may influence people's thoughts and decisions about changing that structure. There's 2 kind of overall final points I want to wrap up with. The first one is, when you're trying to determine the balance between standardization and creativity, the company's business requirements are what should drive decisions. Those business requirements are often different from what content creators, managers, and other stakeholders may personally want. Now, if the business requirements and the personal wants of stakeholders are the same thing, that is great. But when they're not, the business requirements are your guiding force in making decisions about those content processes. And the second point I want to close with is something that I really have to remind myself about a lot. And that is, just because something is technical does not mean it is not creative. I think folks in TechCom in particular, we get so close to the technology we use daily, and that's both the tools we use to create content, and in the case of TechCom, the tools that we are actually documenting. We get so close to those things, we cannot appreciate all of the work and creative decisions that were made to make that technology possible. You do not have to understand every single element, every single mechanism or benefit that's offered by an XML standard like DITA, like S1000D, to appreciate the very deep creativity and thought that it took to develop those processes. So if anybody attending this webcast has been part of a committee that developed an XML standard, my hat is off to you. I thank you for your work because I know it took a lot of your time and effort to make that happen. I want to give you now those resources that I promised earlier in the webcast. First, if you'd like to take a look at the Word file for the PDF settings, you can find it at tiny.cc PDF settings. And we are recording this presentation. We will send you a link to it so you can get this information from the recording as well. I have two resources on InDesign and XML I'd like to share. First, my coworker Sarah O'Keefe wrote a really good blog post a few months ago on InDesign and DITA, and you can see it at that link there, tiny.cc InDesign-DITA. You can also download the IDML specifications in PDF format. I think it's about 500 pages, so it's a pretty hefty document that Adobe created, and it's at tiny.cc IDML. I also want to point you to a resource on managing change from the Content Strategy 101 book I authored. You can see some information on change management at tiny.cc manage-change. I have also written a series of blog posts that summarizes each of these case studies. You can see them at tiny.cc balancing case studies. And now we can take a look at the questions and comments that you had from earlier. We have a question.
A few questions come in. So first,
go ahead, Gretel. You can help me out with that.
It looks like we had a question. This was back in regard to the first case study when we're talking about creating these PDF style sheets. And so in regard to creating and then updating them, we have a question about why a programmer, it doesn't have to be and often isn't. And I think you touched a little bit on that, but I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit more.
In our experience at Scriptorium anyways, a lot of our clients, when it comes to the development and maintenance of style sheets, they do not have in-house resources to do that work. It is not generally, to get technical about it, extensible style sheet language. There's two varieties, XSLT, which is more for HTML, and XSL-FO, formatting objects for PDF. That is a skill set that's not generally in the wheelhouse of content creators. And even if a company has a lot of programmers on staff, in my experience anyways, XSLT and XSLFO are not skill sets they have. A lot of times we will offer to train people at these companies so they can have those skill sets, but I have seen many managers say, no, we don't want to train a resource on that because it is a very, I don't know if esoteric is the right word. It's not a skill set that's going to be used a whole lot. And frankly, a lot of companies are concerned if they train someone on that, and that resource leaves, they will be stuck with no one with that skill set. So yes, there are a lot of people who may have those skill sets, but in my experience anyways, they have not been people who have been in content creation, or the programmers that we do work with and product developers do not have that particular programming expertise.
So I have another question that kind of leads off of your answer to the previous one, which is, could you speak about some formatting of HTML and in particular HTML5 output, and is it basically the same as formatting for PDF?
With HTML versus PDF, there are more things to consider. One good thing about PDF formatting is that because you're talking about a page-based paradigm, it is somewhat limiting to the information you need to collect. And it's very easy to collect those specifications in tables like I showed you in that Word file. HTML, it gets a lot more difficult. There's a lot of technology underneath that you don't have these concerns with on the PDF side. For example, if you've got a web services team, you need to find out what servers they're using, what is the underlying type of way that they're sharing this information. So you've got to look at several things. You've got to look at style sheets. You've got to look at what's underneath the web server, what operating system is running, things like that. There are a lot of much more technical considerations on the HTML. And in the case of HTML, we have a similar Word file for collecting this information, but there are much more open-ended questions there because it is a lot harder to say, just specify the width here or something like that. There are more bigger picture questions that are not easily addressed with a checkbox or filling out a field in a form.
We have a comment here, and I'd like to see if you agree or disagree with this, that says the use of sub-steps is a different, less egregious issue than the number of steps.
When you combine those two things together, when you've got, say, 100 plus steps and 3 layers of steps, and you're, for example, trying to comprehend that information on a smartphone, I would say both the 3 layers of steps and the number of steps are equally problematic.
And then it looks like we have two questions that really are kind of combined into one. And this looks like it came in regard to the case study with those steps and sub-steps and sub-substeps. And that is, had the content already been translated? If so, the cost would be higher to change the structure. But if the content had not already been translated, this would be a good time to restructure the 100-step procedure, especially if it would help reduce the translation cost by making the content more streamlined for the translators. So I wanted to get your opinion on that.
To my knowledge, there had already been some translation, but not to every new language. So there would have been a case where I think your latter suggestion would be correct. It would be a good time to reevaluate. Anytime you are making a change to a process, it is time to fix things that aren't working. And even though we really felt it was in the best interest of the company overall, and by the way, the company overall, that was our true client on this project. We felt it was in the best interest of the company to break up that content into smaller procedures without the sub-steps. The content creators, from my point of view, really had an agenda, and that was about keeping things at the status quo so they could maintain, I guess, what you would call their power over the process. So I agree with the question, the person asking the question. It was a really good time to restructure the content and reevaluate the things that had been done in the past. But these content creators had an agenda and biases that unfortunately prevented us from doing that.
That's all the questions that we had. So this is kind of a last chance for anyone else that has more questions. And then if we don't get any more in within the next minute or so, we can, Alan, do you want to give some contact information where people can email you?
Absolutely, I will share that. You can email me at my email address, asp@scriptorium.com. And you can also check out my contributions and my coworkers' contributions to Scriptorium's blog at scriptorium.com/blog. And I thank everyone for their time today.
And I don't see any new questions coming in, so at this point, we'll just go ahead and close things out. And then if you have any other questions later, you can reach Alan at that contact information.
Thank you.